Have you ever wrongly accused someone because you thought you had the right to? Have you ever believed what your eyes saw, only to find out your heart was blind? It is the story of a man who had it all: power, money, fame. But one fateful afternoon, he lost the most precious thing, the trust of his own son. A false accusation, a look of fear, and an innocent woman suddenly became a victim of prejudice because of her skin color and status. If it were you, when the truth came out, when your 7-year-old looked you straight in the eye and asked Dad, "Why did you lie?" what would you do? Keep your pride to protect your reputation, or dare to lower yourself to keep the last bit of humanity? This is not just a story about a maid or a billionaire. It is a journey to find the light in the soul, a reminder that sometimes a small truth from a child is enough to awaken a cold heart. Join me on that journey, where tears, truth, and kindness meet, in the story, Billionaire Accuses Black Maid of Beating His Son. But the little boy's words shocked the cop. If you believe that kindness still exists, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue telling stories that heal people's hearts. The Westlake neighborhood is about 10 miles north of downtown Dallas. Large houses stand close together, lawns trimmed to a smooth, water-like surface. The night sky is overcast and moonless. As police sirens pierce the darkness, windows light up, and neighbors peek through curtains, eyes filled with curiosity. A police car slid slowly down the granite driveway, its red and blue lights sweeping across the white walls of the mansion of Richard Hale, the richest tech billionaire in the area. Inside, everything was chaos. The oak door was wide open. The old clock in the hall was still ticking heavily. In the middle of the living room stood Richard, his face red with anger, his tie loose, his voice hoarse. "She hit my son. I want her arrested immediately before him." Clara Johnson, a black woman of about 36, wearing a faded blue maid's uniform, stood trembling. Her hands were clenched together. Her eyes were wet. "Sir, it's not like that. I would never hurt the boy." Her voice was so soft, it almost lost its resonance with the rain outside. But Richard didn't hear it, or perhaps he didn't want to hear it. At the foot of the stairs, 8-year-old Jacob sat huddled, clutching a broken plastic toy truck. He looked from his father to Clara, his eyes bewildered. 3 police officers entered. The leader was Daniel Ross, a stocky middle-aged man with deep brown eyes. He glanced around the large room, the crystal chandeliers reflecting off the polished tiles. The opulent scene dwarfed Clara. "What's going on here, Mr. Hale?" Daniel asked calmly. Richard pointed at Clara, his voice harsh. "I heard Jacob scream, ran out, and saw her grabbing the boy. The boy was crying. His face was red. What more proof do you need?" Clara quickly shook her head. "No, it's not like that. He was playing near the stairs and slipped. I tried to hold him back, but we both fell down a step. I didn't." "Shut up," Richard interrupted, his voice cold. "I hired you to take care of my child, not to harm him." The room fell silent. The clock struck again. A drop of rain fell from the policeman's raincoat to the floor, making a dry sound. Daniel tilted his head slightly, looking at the boy. "Jacob, can you tell me what happened?" The boy bit his lip, his eyes glued to the floor. His small hand clenched the broken toy, not saying a word. Richard crossed his arms and breathed heavily. "He's scared because he was beaten. Do you see Clara choked? I didn't hit him. I consider him my own child." Richard turned to her. "Don't lie, Clara. Do you know you're in front of the police?" A breeze blew through, making the curtains flutter. The smell of rain and wet grass filled the heavy air. Daniel sighed. He saw fear in Clara's eyes, not just fear of being fired, but fear of being trampled upon once more by someone in power. He lowered his voice. "Mr. Hale, we will need to hear both sides." Richard frowned, his voice still full of authority. "I have security cameras, but I don't need to review them. I believe what I see." Daniel looked at him, his eyes filled with fatigue. "Sometimes, sir, what we believe is not necessarily right." Richard didn't reply. He turned away, sat down on the leather chair, and poured himself a glass of wine. His hand shook slightly. The anger was still burning, but there was a hint of unease creeping in, a feeling he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. As for Clara, she stood still, looking at the child huddled in the corner. Her heart ached. Since the day she entered this house, she had cared for Jacob like her own son. The boy was often sick, rarely smiled. His father was always busy with meetings or on the phone. She was the only one telling stories and singing lullabies. Now, he sat there, silent before her injustice. Outside, the rain began to fall harder. Police lights shone through the windows, casting shadows and light on the faces of the three people. Daniel signaled to the other two officers, "Keep the scene intact. No one leaves." Then he stepped closer to Jacob. His voice was low and warm. "Hey, little guy," he said. "I know it's not always easy to tell the truth, but I promise. I just want to help." The boy looked up. There was something in his tear-filled eyes that stopped Daniel. Fear and struggle. There was a long silence. The old clock ticked again. No one said anything more. But the atmosphere in that luxurious room seemed about to explode. The rain pattered on the roof tiles. The light from the living room reflected off the polished floor, the light dancing on the black police boots. No one said anything else. Just Richard's heavy breathing, Jacob's soft sobs, and Clara's teary eyes. Daniel Ross walked slowly to the center of the room, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. Hale, I understand your concern for your son, but we need to verify before we jump to any conclusions." Richard leaned back in his chair, a glass of sparkling amber wine in his hand. He sneered. "Verification? I just saw it with my own eyes. What more do you need?" His voice echoed in the vast, cold room. Clara stood still in the corner, clutching the hem of her skirt. Tears streamed down her face, but she made no sound. Deep down, she knew that to people like Mr. Hale, her words were like dust falling in this gilded room. Daniel let out a soft breath, his eyes shifting to Jacob. "Jacob, I just need you to be honest. Are you hurt anywhere?" The boy shook his head, his small shoulders shaking. Richard slammed his glass down on the table. "See, he was too scared to speak. She must have done something." Clara looked up, her voice trembling but clear. "Mr. Hale, I swear to God, I didn't hit the boy. I was just trying to catch him when he slipped." Richard turned away, his lips pressed together. In the pale yellow light, his face showed the tension. His usually sharp eyes showed a flicker of uncertainty, but he quickly suppressed it with his familiar firmness. Daniel nodded slightly, signaling the other two officers to check the stairs. One of them used a flashlight and saw a small scratch on the wooden handrail and a broken toy car lying on the second step. "There are signs of a fall, sir, but no blood or anything else," an officer reported. Richard replied quickly, his voice harsh. "She might have knocked it down and then tried to save it. I've seen her like that before. First she's loyal, then she's unfaithful. Clara looked at him, her voice choked. I've been here for 3 years, and I've never done anything wrong. You may think I'm poor, or have a different skin color, but I never lie. The words made the air thick. Daniel blinked. In that moment, he realized this was no longer a simple assault. Something deeper, a pain from the past, was causing Richard to react so radically. Richard turned around, his eyes flashing with pride. I don't discriminate, but you work for me. I have the right to protect my son. Clara looked straight at him. Her voice was low and strangely calm. Defending by condemning an innocent man. Sir. The question was like a thin blade cutting through the air. Richard stiffened, his eyes trembling slightly, but then he turned away, avoiding her gaze. Daniel moved closer, lowering his voice. Mr. Hale, perhaps we should talk privately. Okay. They stepped out into the hallway, where the lights were dim and the rain was falling steadily on the porch. Daniel asked, his voice low and controlled. Are you sure you can see clearly? Richard answered immediately, almost sharply. I am not mistaken. I heard the boy scream. I saw her bend down, and then he cried. I lost my mother when I was a child, because of the carelessness of the maid. I will not let that happen again. Daniel looked at him for a long time, his eyebrows slightly furrowed. He understood. This was not just anger, but an old wound that had never healed. I understand you, but every word you say now can cause someone to lose their whole life. Richard was silent. The sound of the rain outside pounding on the eaves was steady, like the heavy beating of his own heart. Inside, Clara sat down on the stairs, her hand touching the broken toy car. She looked at Jacob, forcing a weak smile. It's okay, little boy. Everything will be okay. Jacob looked up. His eyes were red. He wanted to say something, but his voice caught in his throat. There was a fear in him that he couldn't name, fear of his father getting angry, of saying the wrong thing and getting Clara into trouble. Daniel stepped closer and asked him gently, Son, do you remember what happened? Jacob looked around, then nodded slightly. But I don't want to make you sad. The truth doesn't make good people sad. Jacob, it just makes them sober. The boy was silent. Richard turned back, his voice colder than before. I think that's enough. You guys go about your business, and I'll talk to the lawyer tomorrow morning. Daniel looked at him, his eyes determined. We will not conclude until we verify clearly. The tension in the air was back. Richard walked over to his son and put his hand on his shoulder. Are you okay, Jacob? You told the police she hit you, right? The boy bowed his head, silent. His small hands clenched the broken cart until they turned white. Richard repeated, his voice softening a little. Just tell the truth, and I will protect you. Jacob looked up at his father, his eyes filled with tears. You will protect everyone, even Clara. Right, Dad. The unexpected question made Richard freeze. He did not answer. The air in the room suddenly became deathly quiet. Daniel slowly turned away, shaking his head slightly. Lightning flashed outside the window, a pale blue light illuminating Clara's face. She looked at them, sighing slightly. A chill ran through her, not from fear of being expelled, but from the knowledge that sometimes people could be judged for being in the wrong place and wearing the wrong skin color. The rain was getting heavier. Daniel looked at his watch, then turned to his two colleagues and said, We'll come back tomorrow morning, when the boy is more ready to talk. Richard nodded dryly. You guys do that. The police left the house. The red and blue lights in the yard faded, leaving behind darkness and the sound of rain. Richard stood looking out the window, his shoulders shaking slightly. Clara bowed her head and walked quietly to the utility room downstairs. Jacob sat there, watching her go, filled with an unnamed anxiety. As the door closed, Richard poured himself another drink. The light reflected off the frosted glass, illuminating his face, torn between anger and emptiness. He looked up at the ceiling, where the sound of rain seemed to pierce his heart. In the dark corner of that luxurious villa, no one knew that. Just one more night, the truth would force everything to change. The house after the rain that night became strangely quiet. The next morning, dew still lingered on the trees in front of the porch. The weak sunlight through the large glass windows reflected on the cold marble floor. A tired atmosphere pervaded the place. Clara woke early as usual. Though her eyes were swollen from crying, she made Jacob breakfast: a bowl of oatmeal with warm milk, a glass of fresh orange juice, and some toast. The faint smell of buttery biscuits wafted through the kitchen. She wasn't sure if Richard would come down for breakfast, but she set out his portion. The habit of serving was ingrained in her, not out of fear, but out of professional pride. Jacob sat at the table, his eyes pensive. He stirred his oatmeal, not eating a bite. Clara gently placed her hand on his shoulder, her voice low and warm. "Boy, are you okay?" Jacob looked up, his clear eyes filled with hesitation. "Miss Clara, I'm sorry. I should say, but I'm scared of Dad." Clara smiled slightly and shook her head. "Don't apologize. Telling the truth is never easy, especially when you're afraid of losing someone you love." The boy was silent. His eyes looked outside, where the dewdrops were melting in the sunlight. A sparrow landed on the railing and flew away. In that brief moment, he wished he could escape the heaviness in his heart, like that little bird. Upstairs, Richard was still sitting in his study. He had barely slept all night. An empty wine glass and scattered contracts lay beside his desk. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Clara's gaze, no pleading, no resistance, just quiet hurt. He jumped up, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain aside. Below, Clara was bending over to set the table. The weak sunlight fell on her face, highlighting her tired but still calm appearance. Jacob sat nearby, quietly drawing on a blank piece of paper. Richard took a deep breath, then closed his eyes. Part of him wanted to step down and apologize, but a cold voice from the past echoed in his head. Men never admit mistakes. Admitting mistakes is weakness. His father's voice still haunted him. As a child, he had watched his father fire a servant on suspicion of theft, without any evidence. The woman cried her eyes out, but his father remained stoic as steel. Little Richard was frightened, but he had learned that the powerful are always right. And now he was doing the same thing again. In the kitchen, Clara was cleaning up the dishes. Jacob raised his head and asked in a small voice, "Do you hate my dad?" The question made Clara pause for a long moment. She wiped her hands and sat down beside him. "No, I don't hate you. I'm just sad. Sad that people sometimes let fear control them. Your father isn't bad. He's just lost." Jacob looked at her, his eyes as if considering something. "Are you leaving? I don't know yet, but I will not leave you." The boy nodded slightly, his eyes still fixed on the broken toy car on the table. He picked up a piece, his tiny fingers gently touching the crack. Tears gradually welled up in his eyes. Clara saw it. Her heart ached. Footsteps echoed from the stairs. Richard appeared in a dark suit, his face hard, but his eyes clearly tired. He stopped at the kitchen threshold, watching the two sitting together. A strange feeling passed through him, warm, but also made him feel out of place in his own home. Clara stood up, trying to keep her voice calm. "I have prepared breakfast, sir." Richard just nodded, not looking at her. He sat down at the table, opened the newspaper, but his eyes stopped on Jacob's drawing a simple sketch of three people holding hands in the sun: a man, a dark-skinned woman, and a small child. He frowned slightly. "What are you drawing?" Jacob replied softly, his voice hesitant. "My family." Richard was silent, the newspaper in his hand shaking. He didn't know what to say. The morning passed heavily. As Richard was about to leave, a police car pulled up in front of the gate. Daniel Ross got out, holding a file in his hand. He nodded to Richard, his voice calm. "Sorry to be back so early. Mr. Hale, I need to ask you a few more questions." Richard tightened his grip on his briefcase. "I thought the matter was over." "Not exactly, sir. We want to make sure there are no mistakes. I also need to speak to Mr. Jacob alone, if you will allow me." Richard looked at his son. The boy avoided his father's gaze, his face slightly frightened. After a few seconds of silence, Richard said slowly, "Okay, but I'll be there." Daniel nodded. He bent down to Jacob's level, his voice soft. "Son, I know you're worried, but I just want to understand what really happened." Jacob glanced at Clara. She smiled and nodded slightly, as if to say, "It's okay." He took a deep breath. "Yesterday, I was playing on the stairs. The toy truck slid down. I tried to reach for it, but my foot slipped. Clara ran over and held me, and we both fell. I was so scared that I screamed." The room fell silent. Daniel looked at Richard. The billionaire's face tensed, then slowly relaxed. "Are you sure, Jacob?" Richard asked softly. "Yes, sure. She saved me, Dad. No one said anything more." The clock on the wall ticked its regular notes. Daniel made a note, then closed the notebook. He spoke slowly, his voice thoughtful. "Thank you. Jacob, I think we have our answer." Richard sat motionless. Clara's image suddenly became painfully clear to him. She showed no resistance, no reproach, only a look of deep sadness. Daniel turned to him. "I will take note of everything. It was probably an accident, sir, but I think you should thank the person who saved your son." With that, he left. The house fell silent again. Richard stood still for a long moment. When he turned, he saw Clara wiping the table, doing it gently, without a word. Jacob stood beside her, looking at his father with worried eyes. Richard opened his mouth to say something, but stopped. His throat was dry. The image of his father flashed through his mind, and he wondered, have I become the man I once hated? Clara raised her head and met his eyes. There were no words between them, only a heavy space where the truth had just entered, but pride had not yet left. Outside the window, the sun was rising. The last drops of dew were melting from the leaves, but inside the house, the air was still thick, as if the rain from last night had never stopped. That afternoon, the Dallas sky was a dull gray, the wind carrying the smell of damp earth after a morning rain. Inside the Hale mansion, the air was quiet, as if any sound was afraid to be raised. From his second-floor study, Richard stood by the window, looking down at the garden where Clara was hanging some white towels to dry. Her every movement was gentle and orderly, as if the night before had been uneventful. He could still clearly remember Daniel Ross's voice as he left. "I think you should thank the person who saved your son." Those words echoed in his head all day. It was not a reproach, but a mirror that looked straight into his heart, a place of shame that he had never dared to face. Richard put his coffee down, took a deep breath, and walked out of the room. When he reached the stairs, Clara was cleaning the living room. She stopped at the sound of footsteps. They looked at each other for a moment, a brief look that held a long night of unspoken words. Richard cleared his throat. "I want to talk." Clara nodded slightly. "Yes, sir." They sat at a table near the window, where the light was soft. There was a long silence. Richard looked at his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. He had never found it so difficult to speak, even when negotiating billion-dollar contracts. "I checked the security cameras." His voice was low and hoarse. "I saw everything. You saved the boy." Clara said nothing, just looked down at the floor. Richard continued, each word heavy. "I was wrong. Not only did I doubt you, I insulted you. And the worst thing is, I did it in front of my son." She shook her head slightly, her voice as light as a breath. "You don't need to say anything more. I understand. You're just worried about the boy." "No," Richard interrupted. "I didn't say it out of obligation. I said it out of shame. I had become the very person I had promised never to be." Clara looked up, looking at him for the first time. There was no resentment in her eyes, just a quiet sadness, like someone who knows too well the pain of others. "I'm not angry, sir. But that fear," she said slowly, "it blinds people. I only hope the boy doesn't learn from it." The words made Richard choke. He bowed his head, guilt tightening his chest. He thought of Jacob, of his son's frightened eyes last night. It wasn't just the fear of seeing adults arguing, it was the fear of losing a safe role model in his life. Small footsteps sounded. Jacob poked his head in the door, still holding the taped toy car. He looked at his father, then at Clara, his eyes uncertain. "Dad." Richard turned, his voice softening. "What is it? Son? Do you hate Clara?" The question was like a needle piercing the silence. Clara lowered her head slightly. Richard looked at his son, his voice choked. "No, I don't hate her. I was wrong. She's a good person. She saved me." Jacob walked over, hugged Clara tightly, then turned to his father, his voice small but clear. "I told you. She's always been good to me." Richard sat still. He felt a pang of regret and weakness. Since his wife's death, he had built a shell of steel around himself. He thought keeping things under control would protect his son, but it had actually pushed him away. Clara gently placed her hand on Jacob's shoulder. "Come on, boy. It's okay. Everything's okay." Richard looked at the two people before him, the woman he had humiliated and the child he had failed as a father. Emotion rose in his throat, choking him. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence. Daniel Ross stood outside, holding a file. As he entered, he nodded to the three of them. "Excuse me for coming back. There are some formalities that need to be completed, and I think we should end this amicably." Richard stood up and gestured for him to sit down. "I checked the cameras. Clara's telling the truth. Thank you, Officer Ross, for believing her." Daniel looked at Clara and smiled. "I was just doing my job, but not everyone can stay calm like you did last night. I have seen many people collapse in situations like that," Clara replied softly. "I used to be a nurse. When I was scared, I learned to breathe and count my heartbeat. The boy needed me to calm down, not to scream." Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with admiration. "You have a very strong heart." Richard stood still, listening to every word. His heart ached because he realized what Daniel had just said was true. Being strong does not mean having power, but knowing how to keep calm in the midst of a storm. When Daniel left, it was dusk. The sunset tinged the windows with gold. Richard stepped out onto the porch where Clara was seeing the policeman off. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Miss Clara, I know my apology isn't enough, but I want to ask, can you stay for Jacob's sake, and because I think this house would be cold without you?" Clara bowed her head slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "I don't know. I need time. I will still take care of the boy. But please let me think." Richard nodded. He did not try to persuade further. The calmness in her words made him understand that broken trust would take a long time to heal. Night fell. Jacob was asleep, in the study. Richard played back the video from the camera, the image of Clara rushing to hug his son before they both fell to the floor. She was not afraid of pain, just trying to protect the child. He sat silently for hours. For the first time in years, Richard felt his heart was no longer made of steel. He took a pen and wrote a letter, each word trembling. "I have learned that money cannot buy dignity, nor can it replace trust. Thank you for saving my son, and for teaching me something I have forgotten all my life to listen." He folded the letter and left it on the kitchen table, where Clara would find it in the morning. When the lights went out, the house was still quiet, but in that silence something had changed, like the first breath after a storm. Outside, a gentle breeze blew through the garden, carrying with it the warm scent of earth after rain. On the second floor, Richard sat looking out the window, the moonlight shining on his face. In his tired eyes, for the first time in many years, there was something rare, tenderness. 3 days had passed since that fateful afternoon. The atmosphere in the Hale mansion seemed to have calmed down, but cracks remained that were invisible to the naked eye. Richard woke earlier than usual. He no longer heard Clara's soft footsteps in the mornings. She was still there, still caring for Jacob, still cleaning up after him. But there was a silence between them now, a silence he knew he had created. He sat in the dining room, looking at the empty chair opposite him. He had always considered silence a form of power. Now it was suffocating. Jacob ran down the stairs, carrying his small bag. He was wearing a striped shirt, his hair neatly combed by Clara. "Good morning, Dad." Richard smiled slightly. "Hello, son. Have you had breakfast?" "Yes. Miss Clara makes pancakes with honey." Richard nodded, a look of confusion flashing in his eyes. "Ah, was it good?" Jacob nodded, smiling brightly. "She said after I go to school. She will go to church to volunteer." Richard paused. He knew Clara spent time at a small church in a poor neighborhood in South Dallas. She helped feed the homeless, cut children's hair. Even though she was just a laborer, she always gave her little to those less fortunate. As the car taking Jacob to school pulled out of the gate, Richard stood silently on the porch, watching Clara prepare to leave. She was wearing a thin coat, an old cloth hat, and carrying a cloth bag containing a few cans of food. The image reminded him of his mother, the woman who had quietly done everything in silence, until life forced her to remain silent forever. Richard called softly, "Clara, wait." She turned back, surprised. "Yes, sir, I can take you." "No need. I'm familiar with this road." "I want to come," Richard said, his voice slow, almost confessional. "Maybe I can learn something from you." Clara looked at him for a moment, then nodded slightly. The black car left the villa area and passed through the tree-lined streets. Dallas was a bright but peaceful morning. Richard drove, his eyes occasionally glancing at Clara sitting next to him. She was silent, watching the scenery pass by the window. They reached a poor neighborhood near the center. Brick houses were patchy, signs faded, and a few homeless people huddled on the sidewalks. The smells of food, car exhaust, and human remains mingled in the hot air. Clara got off the plane and greeted the other volunteers. Everyone knew her and smiled when they saw her. Richard stood by, watching quietly. He saw her hand out boxes of food, speaking to each person in a gentle voice, calling them by name, asking about them like old friends. A brown-skinned boy, about 7 years old, ran up and hugged Clara's legs. "Clara, you're here again." "Yes, I brought extra cookies today." "Can you share some with your friends?" The sight made Richard choke. For a moment, he saw something he had long forgotten, simple kindness, without fame or fortune to prove it. After handing out the food, they sat on the church steps to rest. Clara opened a bottle of water and handed it to Richard. "I didn't think you'd come. Actually," he sighed, "I haven't been able to sleep these past few days. I've been thinking about what I've done. I used to think that power lies in making others listen, but it turns out it actually lies in knowing how to listen." Clara smiled, a fleeting smile. Perhaps he was learning what life taught all over again. Richard nodded slightly. "I have forgotten how to be a father. I only know how to give my child money in a good school, but I have never made him feel loved." "Clara, do you know, I am jealous of you." Clara looked at him in surprise. "Jealous? Yes. Because Jacob trusted you more than me. He smiled at you more, told you more stories. I used to think it was a betrayal, but now I understand. It was just the love I didn't give him." Clara looked at him for a long time. "You can start over. Children forgive easily, as long as they see that adults are sincere." Richard pursed his lips at that. He looked into the distance, where the gray clouds were slowly dissolving in the sunlight. That evening, when they returned, Jacob was home. He was playing in the yard, his face beaming. He was surprised to see his father and Clara getting out of the car together. "Dad is coming with you." "Yes." Richard bent down and patted his son's head. "She gave Dad a little lesson." Jacob's eyes widened. "Studying." "Yes, a lesson in being human." The boy laughed, but Clara remained silent, a slightly sad smile on her lips. That night, when Jacob was asleep, Richard walked into the kitchen. Clara was cleaning, the light shining on her face. He stood still for a moment, then said, "I have a suggestion." "Yes, sir. I want you to help me. Not as a maid, but as a family counselor. I need you to teach me how to talk to my son, how to make him feel loved." Clara looked up, stunned. "Are you sure?" "Sure. I know you can leave at any time, and I won't blame you. But if you stay, I don't want you to be an employee. I want you to be someone I can trust." She looked at him for a long time, then nodded slightly. "If it is true, I will stay, but not for the money. I will stay for the boy." "I understand," Richard replied, his voice trembling slightly. "And perhaps for me too." Clara smiled faintly. She said nothing more, just nodded and continued stacking the dishes. But as she turned away, something glinted in her eyes' relief, mixed with a glimmer of newfound confidence. Late at night, Richard stood in front of Jacob's bedroom door. The boy was sleeping, hugging his toy car tightly. The moonlight filtered through the window. illuminating his peaceful face. He sat down by the bed and whispered, "I'm sorry, son. From now on, I'll learn to be a real father." The boy turned over and smiled softly in his sleep. Richard sat there for a long time until the sky outside faded. Something inside him had changed forever, a new strength, not from money or power, but from humility. And it was also in that quiet night that he realized there are wounds that cannot be healed by success, but can only be healed by human love. The mornings in the Hale mansion were no longer filled with heavy silence. Instead, Jacob's soft laughter echoed in the kitchen, mixed with the clanking of knives and forks. The morning sunlight streamed through the glass windows, shining on the dining table, where three people sat together, no longer separated by space. Clara poured Jacob some more milk, and he happily told her about yesterday's art lesson. Richard sat across from her, listening, occasionally smiling genuinely, a rare smile that his staff rarely saw. "What are you drawing?" he asked softly. "I drew our house, with Dad, Clara, and me, and Ross," Jacob said, his eyes lighting up. "I put it on my desk in class. The teacher said it was hot." Clara smiled, her eyes warm. "Teacher is right. It is warmer in this house now than before." Richard was silent, but he knew from the look she gave him that she was telling the truth. The once cold mansion now seemed to be alive. In the evenings, he read stories to his children, sometimes listening to Clara tell little stories about the old hospital where she used to work as a nurse. Things were getting better, at least, until the past started knocking on the door. That afternoon, Daniel Ross came to visit. He walked in with a friendly smile, dressed in civilian clothes, no longer stern as a police officer. Jacob ran out to hug him, excitedly showing him the drawing. "Nice boy." Daniel patted his head. "You look happier than last time." Richard shook his hand, smiling sincerely. "Thank you for coming back. We're having dinner tonight. Please stay." "I am very pleased," Daniel replied. That night, dinner was warm. Clara cooked honey-roasted chicken, the aroma filling the house. They talked about movies, Jacob's school, and Richard's sponsorship of a community project, a free programming center for poor teenagers. Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with surprise and secret joy. "You really want to do that?" Richard nodded, his voice calm. "I used to think of charity as a way to promote my name. Now I just want to do something useful. Maybe I learned that from you." Clara bowed her head slightly, a smile playing on her lips. Daniel watched the scene, nodding in satisfaction. After dinner, when Jacob had gone upstairs, Daniel sat with Richard in the living room. His glass of wine was swaying in his hand. "You have changed a lot, Richard. When I first met you, I saw a man who could destroy anyone with just one word. Now I see a man who has learned to listen." Richard looked out the window, where the yellow light fell on the trees. "Maybe. Sometimes we have to lose almost everything to understand what is important," Daniel pondered. "And Clara, do you think she will stay forever?" Richard was silent for a long moment before saying, "I don't know. I never thought someone like her would come into my life. She makes me feel small, but in a good way." Daniel smiled. "Small enough to be grateful." "Right." Richard nodded. That night, when everyone was asleep, a strong wind swept through the garden. Moonlight fell on the wooden floor where Clara was folding clothes. Suddenly the phone rang. She picked it up and saw an unfamiliar number. After a moment of hesitation, she picked it up. "Clara Johnson, listen here." A male voice rang out, deep but cold. "Are you still using this number?" "Clara, It's been a long time. She stopped, her heart beating fast. Who is it? Me. Malcolm. Do you remember the one you left when things went haywire at St. Mary's? Clara gripped the phone tightly, her voice trembling slightly. What are you calling me for? I hear you work for the Hale family. Famous billionaires. Interesting. You always pick a good place. She closed her eyes, suppressing her anger. What do you want, Malcolm? I need money. Clara. Just a little. Otherwise, someone will know about that patient died from wrong dose of medicine story that year. A chill ran down her spine. The past she tried to hide had found her. I know it was an accident. I reported it. But people don't know that. Do they? You left the hospital right after that. I lost my job. If you don't help me, I'll let the press know. It's a sensational story. The billionaire's maid was involved in the death of a patient. Clara couldn't say anything. She could only hear the wind blowing outside, cold and numbing. I'll give you 3 days, Malcolm said, then hung up. The room fell silent. Clara sank into a chair, her hands shaking. The image of Jacob, of this warm home, of the budding trust, all seemed fragile and about to collapse. The next morning, Richard noticed Clara's face was pale. Are you unwell? I'm just a little tired. Maybe it's because of insomnia, she replied quickly. He looked at her, his eyes worried. You can take a few days off if you need. It's okay. I'm fine. But inside she was in chaos. She didn't want Richard or Jacob to know. They were too good. She didn't want to hurt either of them. That evening, when the family gathered, Clara sat quietly. Richard told Jacob jokes, and there was laughter. But her mind was elsewhere. Her gaze fell on the child's face, innocent, carefree, completely unaware of the approaching storm. When Richard saw Jacob up to his room, he turned back and saw Clara still sitting on the chair. Clara, what's the matter? You've been quiet all night. She looked up slightly and forced a smile. No, I was just thinking about something. If there is anything I can help with. It's okay, sir. I can handle it myself. Richard was about to say more, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She didn't want pity. She was fighting something. He could feel it. Late at night, Clara sat by the window, the moonlight shining on her face. She opened a drawer and took out an old piece of paper, a copy of the medical report from that year patient died due to an unexpected drug reaction. Nursing staff member Clara Johnson was present at the scene. She looked at it for a long time, then folded it and put it in her bag. She knew that if Malcolm did it, everything would fall apart. But if she paid him, he would keep coming back. She had only one choice: face it. Outside, the wind picked up again, blowing the white curtains. Somewhere in the villa, Richard was still awake. The light in his study was still on. 2 people, each with a secret, were sitting in the same house, unaware that their real test had just begun. The sky in Dallas was overcast that day, with gray clouds covering the sky. Clara left for work earlier than usual. She didn't tell anyone that Malcolm had called back the night before, his voice cold and curt. 3 days are up. Clara, I'll wait at the old coffee shop on the corner of Elm Street. Don't make me go to Hale's. She knew he was telling the truth. Malcolm wasn't just greedy, he was dangerous, and could ruin her life with a single phone call. She went to the small cafe tucked away on the side of the road. The gray sky reflected off the glass tables. Malcolm sat in the corner, thinner than before, but still calculating. When he saw her, he smiled faintly. Right on time. She is still polite as ever. How much do you want? Clara asked, her voice calm but her hands shaking slightly. $50,000. He said it as if it was a small number. For you, working for a billionaire is not hard to earn. I don't have that money. Then I'll get something else. Malcolm pulled out an envelope and placed it on the table. Here's a copy of the old report, plus the article I'm about to send out. Billionaire Hale's maid was involved in a patient's death. Sounds interesting. Right. Clara stared at him. You are destroying an innocent person. I call it an opportunity. He sneered. Life is not fair to anyone. She stood up, her eyes cold. If you think I will let you go, you are wrong. I will not let you threaten anyone else. What would you do? Call the police. They would ask why you left the hospital. And then what? Would Mr. Hale keep you here if he knew you were keeping secrets like that? Clara was silent. He knew her weakness, not money, but the trust she had just rebuilt. She left the bar and walked down the street in the cold wind. Her mind was in turmoil. She wasn't afraid for herself. She was afraid of what would happen to Richard and Jacob if this got out. That evening, Richard was preparing documents for a meeting when he received a call from a former reporter who had worked with his company on a media project. Mr. Hale, sorry to bother you. I just wanted to ask quickly, do you have any comment on the news that your maid, Clara Johnson, was involved in a medical death 5 years ago? Richard was stunned. The question struck like a bolt from the blue. Oh, what did you say? An anonymous source just sent documents. There is a copy of the medical report. We have not published it yet, but want to verify. Richard was silent for a few seconds, then said softly, I will check. Don't post anything until I contact you again. He hung up, his heart burning. He hurried downstairs. Clara was packing up Jacob's toys. Clara. His voice was louder than intended. She turned around, startled. What's the matter, sir? I just got a call. He looked her straight in the eyes. Someone said you were involved in the death of a patient. Clara's face turned pale. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Is that true? Richard asked, his voice hoarse, a mixture of anger and disappointment. You've been keeping this from me? She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Yes, it happened. But it was an accident. I didn't run away. I filed a report, but the hospital wanted to bury the incident to protect its reputation. I was forced to leave. Why didn't you say so earlier? Because I know you won't believe me. Her voice choked. You've already accused me once. I don't have the courage to go through it again. Richard clenched his fists. All the memories came flooding back the moment he had accused her of hitting Jacob. The irrational anger, the look of fear in his son's eyes. He knew she was telling the truth, but the pain of betrayal kept him from believing it immediately. Who is that? He asked. Who spread this news? An old colleague, Malcolm Reed. He wants to blackmail me. I won't let him drag you into this. Richard stood still, then said softly, It's too late. He's done it. The atmosphere in the room became suffocatingly heavy. Clara bowed her head, her eyes blurred. I'm leaving. I don't want to cause you and Jacob any trouble. Clara, wait. But she went upstairs, walked quickly, and did not look back. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He called Daniel Ross. When he finished listening, Daniel said, I know Malcolm. He was investigated for falsifying documents, but there was no evidence. Let me find him. The next morning, Clara left the villa early, leaving a short note on the kitchen table. Thanks for everything. Tell Jacob I have to go back to the countryside for a while. When Jacob woke up and couldn't find Clara, he burst into tears. Richard held his son, his heart heavy. For the first time, he felt real loss. Meanwhile, Daniel found Malcolm in a rundown motel on the outskirts. He tried to leave when he saw a police car, but was stopped. After several hours of interrogation, he confessed everything, including the fabrication of the documents and the sending of false information to the press. Daniel called Richard as soon as he finished. "It's clear. Clara's innocent. I have evidence that the hospital wanted to cover up the incident because of faulty medication from the supplier. Not the nurse's fault." Richard gasped. "Where is she?" "I don't know. But maybe she went back to her hometown. She once told me the most peaceful place is the cemetery, where she buried her sister." Richard was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Send me the address. I will go." That afternoon, he drove out of Dallas, through quiet country roads. It was dark when he stopped in a small Louisiana town. The fields on either side were sparkling with fireflies. Clara was sitting on the steps in front of the old chapel, holding an old Bible. When she saw him, she stopped. "Why are you here?" Richard stepped forward, panting from the long walk. "Because I can't let you go like that. I know the truth. He's been caught. It's not your fault. Clara." She looked at him, tears falling, but still trying to smile. "I'm not afraid of the truth. I'm only afraid of people using it to hurt the people I love." Richard shook his head slightly, his voice low and firm. "I should be the one afraid, because I doubted you again. But this time, I won't let the past win." She was silent, then said softly, "You don't owe me anything, Richard." "Yes, I owe you my trust, and I want to repay it." He held out his hand. A long moment passed. Then Clara placed her hand on his. The grip was light, but enough to dispel so many doubts, so many years of loneliness in two once-closed souls. In the sky, the last rays of the day shone down, like a new dawn in their lives. Dallas media never misses a sensational story, especially when it involves Richard Hale. Despite Daniel Ross's testimony that proved Clara's innocence, headlines still flooded the internet. The Black Maid and the Secrets of a Billionaire's Mansion, love, guilt, and the truth behind the Hale family's glamorous family. Richard read the words on the screen, feeling both anger and helplessness. He had been a news manipulator before, and knew how public opinion could twist the truth with just a few words. But this time, the one hurt was Clara, the woman he owed so much. That afternoon, Clara sat in the living room with Jacob. He was practicing coloring, occasionally looking up and asking, "Clara, why do people talk badly about you on TV?" Clara smiled softly, her voice as soft as the wind. "Because sometimes people only hear what they want to believe, my child. But the truth always has a way of finding its way back." Jacob nodded and continued coloring. "I know you're good. You saved my life. I'll tell everyone." Clara smiled slightly, but there was a glint of tears in her eyes. Sometimes a child's words have a power the rest of the world doesn't have. That evening, Richard walked in, his face grim. "I've just spoken to my lawyers. They've advised me not to appear in public until the news dies down. But I can't sit by and watch you get so wrongly accused." Clara shook her head. "You don't have to do anything for me, Richard. The truth will come out. But I owe you," he said softly. "I ruined your reputation with a single accusation. I cannot let history repeat itself." Clara was silent for a moment and then looked at him. "If you really want to do something useful, not just for me, but for all those who have no voice." That thought kept Richard thinking all night. He remembered the people Clara had helped at the church, The look in their eyes, so grateful and hopeful. And then he made a decision. 3 days later, Richard appeared at a press conference at the company headquarters. Dozens of reporters crowded in, flashbulbs flashing. He stepped onto the podium, without a communications director, without a script, just himself, a naked man before the public. He looked straight into the camera. "I want to talk about a woman I have wronged twice. Her name is Clara Johnson. She was a nurse, saved lives, and suffered injustice from the system. She did not commit a crime. She only made one mistake, believing that kindness would be trusted." The room was silent. Richard continued, his voice low but clear. "I used to think money could make me right. But it turns out that only truth and courage make a person worthy of respect. Today, Clara, in front of everyone, I apologize for ever doubting you. And if anyone wants to know what real strength is, it is the tolerance you have shown me and my son." The words went viral. Thousands of comments flooded social media. Many who had criticized Clara now apologized, sharing her story as a symbol of resilience and kindness. That night, when the press conference was replayed on TV, Clara sat silently in front of the screen. Jacob leaned his head on her shoulder, and Richard sat in the chair opposite, his eyes fixed on her face. "You don't have to do that," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "I can't help it," Richard replied. "I no longer want to live in a house built on silence and fear. I want Jacob to grow up knowing that when he's wrong, he has to dare to correct it." She looked at him, her smile gentle but sad. "You have changed a lot. Thanks." There was a moment of silence. The clock ticked. Outside, the first summer rain began to fall, light but persistent. Clara stood up and walked to the window. The light reflected on her face. The light seemed to melt into tears. Sometimes I think, if I hadn't gone back to that house that day, maybe things would have been different. But now I understand. God let me meet you and your father for a reason. Not to work, but to learn to forgive. Richard came to her side, looking out at the sky. "Me too. It took me years to learn to bow my head, but only a few days with you to understand that self-respect is not about power, but about how you treat others." After a long moment, he continued, his voice choking Clara, "I know you can leave at any time, but if you stay, I want you to be part of this family. Not as a servant, but as someone Jacob and I need." Clara turned and looked at him for a long time. There was both emotion and a vague fear in her eyes. "I don't know if I have the courage to believe again." "Let me be your believer," he said, placing his hand gently on his heart. "I owe you my trust, and I intend to repay it with the rest of my life." There were no words after that, just the sound of rain falling steadily on the roof. A quiet but meaningful moment where two broken souls found a rare peace. The next morning, when Jacob woke up, he found his father making coffee and Clara baking cookies. They both laughed as he ran down the stairs, his hair a mess. "Are we going to church today?" Clara asked, her voice as light as the morning breeze. Richard nodded. "All three of us." The small church in the poor neighborhood was the same as always, with rows of old wooden pews and the sound of choir singing. But today, as they entered, people turned around, many with emotional looks, some with quiet respect. After the ceremony, an elderly woman took Clara's hand. "Thank you. Your story has given many of us more faith in justice." Clara smiled gently, and Richard stood behind her, looking at her as if he saw something money could never buy: dignity. That evening, The three of them returned. The sun was setting, leaving a warm twilight over the Hale mansion. Jacob ran around the garden, his laughter echoing in the distance. Richard turned to Clara, his eyes filled with gratitude. Perhaps, thanks to you, this house finally has a soul. It wasn't me. Richard, she replied softly. You opened the door. The sky turned amber. A gentle breeze rustled the trees. Clara looked up and smiled, a smile as light as the morning. Inside that once cold house, now echoed laughter, voices, and even the sound of the small piano Jacob was learning. It was no longer a mansion of loneliness, but a home of forgiveness. In the light of day, Richard thought to himself, there are wounds that don't need to be forgotten. They just need to be understood. And there are people who just need to trust each other once, to change their whole life. This story is not just about a false accusation, but the awakening of a person who thought he had lost the ability to love. From Richard, who believed that money could cover up all wrongs, to Clara, the woman who quietly chose to forgive rather than blame. All remind us that kindness does not need to be acknowledged. It just needs to be felt. In life, we sometimes rush to judge others by our own perspective, forgetting that everyone has a story behind those tired eyes. This story teaches us to listen before condemning, to bow our heads when wrong, and to know that kindness, no matter how small, can change a person's life. If you have ever hurt someone because of a misunderstanding, remember, sorry does not make you weaker. It makes you more human. And if you have ever been judged, trust that truth and time will be the most powerful voices. Thank you for listening to this story. If you found it touching, please like, share, and subscribe so we can continue to bring you stories of kindness, forgiveness, and faith in humanity.